high in the Appalachian hills, where the ridges hide more than they reveal, and silence lingers heavier than smoke. There lives a family whose very name became legend, the Whitakers. To some, they were nothing more than a grotesque curiosity, malformed, living on the edge of survival. To others, they were monsters, whispered about in taverns and gas stations as cannibals, as creatures born of blood turned inward for too many generations. But the truth is darker, stranger, and far more human. It is a story of hunger so deep it broke taboos, of isolation that became a prison, and of a family buried alive in shame. This is the untold story of the Whitaker family secrets. The mountains have always hidden secrets. Their ridges rise like jagged walls. Their hollows sink into shadow. Their trees stand as watchmen of forgotten lives. In Appalachia, stories cling to the mist, like cobwebs, whispered from porch to porch, half believed and half feared. Among those whispers, one name returns again and again. Spoken with a shiver of fascination and dread, the Whitakers. Their home was not built for the eye of the world. It was a place the sun barely touched, where dirt paths dissolved into thickets, and dogs barked at strangers with an almost human fury. The shack stood hunched, patched together with rusted tin and rotting wood, a structure that seemed to breathe with the weight of generations. Its walls did not merely shelter a family, they imprisoned them. Inside, silence was louder than words, broken only by grunts, murmurs, and the restless shuffle of bare feet across worn floors. Isolation shaped the Whitakers long before their legend spread. Their world was one of poverty so deep it stripped life down to its barest elements. Food was scarce. Winter bit hard. Hunger was a constant visitor at their table, a visitor that drove choices few could imagine. Some said they turned inward, not only for love but for survival. Brothers, sisters, cousins' lines blurred until kinship became a cycle, each generation folding back upon itself. The Whitakers lived in a loop, and the mountains became the bars of their cage. What outsiders saw was enough to brand them monsters. Eyes that wandered in opposite directions, jaws slack, words that never fully formed. Children whose laughter sounded strange, whose movements seemed unsteady, unnatural. Two neighbors, they were the living embodiment of every Appalachian nightmare, the cautionary tale of what happens when blood stays too close. Stories grew wild whispers of Whitakers, who not only married within but ate within, who resorted to cannibalism in winters too cruel to bear. Were these rumors truth, or were they the cruel inventions of a society that needed monsters to define itself against? The mountains never answered, and the Whitakers never spoke. Step inside their world, and the first thing you notice is the silence. Not the gentle silence of peace, but the heavy silence of repression, of secrets bound so tightly that words could not contain them. A boy rocks on the porch, staring into the forest with wide, unfocused eyes. A woman hums a melody without words, her voice drifting like smoke in the stagnant air. A man sits in the corner, his face unreadable, his body rigid as though braced against some unseen weight. The family communicates in fragments, gestures, grunts, glances, language worn down to its bones. Neighbors remembered encounters as haunting and unforgettable. To cross paths with a Whitaker child in the woods was to meet a presence both innocent and eerie. Their stares lingered too long, their silences pressed too hard. Sometimes they begged for food, sometimes they simply watched, saying nothing, their features marked by generations of isolation. Those who dared approach their hollow described the air itself as thick, suffocating, a place where nature seemed reluctant to breathe. And yet, behind the deformities, behind the whispers of cannibalism, behind the fear and ridicule, there were moments of raw humanity. A mother cradling her baby, singing softly to keep it warm through a long winter night. Brothers gathering firewood together, their movements clumsy, but filled with persistence. A child clutching a battered toy with both hands, as though it were a lifeline to a world he would never know. These were not monsters. These were people broken, shaped by poverty and silence. But still, people. The legend of the Whitakers became larger than the Whitakers themselves. Appalachia carried their name like a curse, attaching to it every fear outsiders had of the mountains: ignorance, deformity, hunger, sin. Their hollow was not just a place, it was a symbol, a reminder of what could happen when the world forgot you, when survival demanded sacrifices too shameful to speak aloud. Whether the tales of cannibalism were truth or myth mattered little. What mattered was that the Whitakers had become a story, their humanity swallowed by the hunger of rumor. As night fell on their shack, the candlelight flickered against walls stained by years of smoke. The family sat in silence, each face caught in shadow, each body carrying the weight of generations. Outside, the forest pressed close, holding their secret tight, and in the distance, the town whispered once more: the Whitakers, the cannibals of Appalachia. The deeper you walk into the Whitaker hollow, the more the air changes. It thickens, it presses against your skin, as though every tree and stone remembers what it has witnessed, and will not let you pass without feeling the weight of it. Outsiders rarely came this far, and those who did seldom returned without carrying the memory for the rest of their lives. For here, in this hidden pocket of Appalachia, time stood still. The world beyond the ridge might have marched forward, roaring, trains cutting through valleys, radios spreading voices across states, but the Whitakers remained locked in another age, bound by a cycle too old and too secret to escape. Inside the shack, nights were endless. Winter came hardest of all, when the mountains swallowed the sun, before evening had even begun, and the cold crept into their very bones. The Whitakers huddled close, not for warmth alone, but for survival itself. Food was scarce, and rumor had it that during those winters, choices were made that no outsider could forgive. Bones buried beneath ash, pots boiled with meat, too stringy, too familiar. The legend of cannibalism took root not in abundance of evidence, but in the hunger of silence. Silence always feeds the worst stories. The family's language had dwindled, until it barely resembled speech. Grunts, cries, gestures, communication stripped down to primal sounds. Some claimed this was proof of their decline, that inbreeding had eroded not only their bodies but their minds. But in truth, the Whitakers' silence was also a shield. Words invited judgment. Words carried the weight of sin in their hollow. Silence was survival. Silence was the only language that could not betray them, and yet, the deformities told their own story. Eyes that failed to align, jaws that never fully closed, limbs bent unnaturally. Every child carried the weight of generations folding in upon themselves. The family tree curling tighter and tighter, until it strangled itself. The Whitakers had not chosen this fate. Isolation had chosen it for them. They were trapped by geography, by poverty, by the simple fact that the world had turned its back. Marriage beyond blood required travel, money, community, and the Whitakers had none of these. The mountains were not just their home, they were their cage. In town, the name Whitaker was spat like a curse. Mothers pulled their children closer. When the family was mentioned, men at gas stations spoke in hushed tones, half in pity, half in revulsion. Stories grew, each darker than the last. Whitaker children lurking at the edges of the woods at night. Whitaker women giving birth to children who cried without sound. Whitaker men hunting not just animals, but something unspeakable. The truth and the myth tangled together until no one could separate them, and perhaps no one wanted to. It was easier to believe the Whitakers were monsters than to admit they were victims of abandonment, of neglect, of a world that had allowed them to rot in silence. Still, fragments of tenderness pierced through the horror. A brother wrapping a ragged blanket around his younger sister. A father, gaunt and wild-eyed, pressing his forehead against the wooden wall, whispering prayers no one could hear. A mother, humming the same melody again and again, until it became a lullaby that outlived her voice. These moments remind us that even in the darkest places, humanity flickers weak, fragile, but unextinguished. By the late 20th century, the Whitakers had become more myth than flesh. They were no longer just a family, they were a symbol, a warning, a grotesque fascination. When photographers and documentarians finally dared to capture them, the world stared, horrified and entranced. Here were faces that seemed to belong to another age, voices that stumbled, lives that carried the imprint of centuries of silence. And yet, when the camera lingered long enough, beyond the deformities and the strangeness, what it revealed was not monstrosity, but pain. Pain carved into every wrinkle, every glance, every silence that filled the hollow. The legend of cannibalism would never be erased. It clung to them like smoke, whether true or not, because the world needed a darker ending than the truth could provide. But what the Whitakers embodied was not savagery. It was abandonment. It was what happens when a family is left to the shadows for so long that the shadows swallow them whole. And so, the shack still stands, its boards sagging, its windows broken, its rooms filled with ghosts. If you listen long enough, you can almost hear it, the hum of a lullaby, the shuffle of bare feet, the silence that once suffocated every corner. The Whitaker Hollow remains a scar upon the mountains, a place where truth and legend blur until they are indistinguishable, and the question lingers, carried on the wind through the Appalachians. Were they monsters, or were they simply forgotten?